well, is this just pie in the sky? Are we just sort of just a talking shop? Nothing's going to happen. Same as it hasn't happened. No changes, no relevant changes in the law in this country over the last decade. All what's happened is fiddling around with the classification of some drugs, changing the penalties for possession a little bit, but basically the structure of the Misuse of Drugs Act is unchanged from when it came in. Do we need to think about this at all then? Well, tomorrow the Liberal Democrats at their national conference are voting on a motion which proposes the scrapping of criminal penalties for personal possession of cannabis and introducing a regulated market for cannabis. I was at the Liberal Democrat conference in 2001 after writing a paper on the subject where they voted on a very, very similar motion. So it has in fact been Liberal Democrat policy at least the last 10 years. I've got a feeling that back in the midst of time they voted on it previously in the same sort of way. So, well, okay, it's topical, but is that going to make any difference? You can get it on the political agenda, at least the Liberal Democrats, but can you get it on the government agenda? There's a California bill going through at the moment called Treat Cannabis Like Wine. There's a strong lobby in favour, of course, of legalisation of possession of cannabis in California and in other places in the States. There's an organisation called LEAP, Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, the means by which I got here, which is a US-based organisation which consists of several thousand ex-police officers, DEA, Drug Enforcement Agency people, judges, former prison governors, who all see the idiocy of the current prohibition in relation to drugs. And that body is getting bigger and more influential. And Transform, with whom probably several people here might be involved one way or another, its latest major publication is about how will regulation of the various drugs markets work, and making specific proposals for that. So maybe there is a bit of a change, and maybe this is not just pie in the sky. Certainly 5 or 6 years ago, Danny Kushlik, who's been the guiding light of Transform, was saying, oh, this is a 10-year project. Well, maybe that means we're halfway through our 10 years and we can expect some changes. The odd eccentric voices, of which I was one 10 or so years ago, have become accepted wisdom. It's very hard to find anybody who knows anything about this subject who will defend the current law. There used to be people who would go on radio and on TV against voices like mine, but there aren't any anymore. So the argument has been won. It's on the political agenda, but not the government's agenda, although the best argued case for legalisation that I've ever seen was the one presented to the Prime Minister when it was Tony Blair about 7 years ago, which finally was squeezed out of the government by Freedom of Information. And it's a terrifically well-argued, clearly presented case for regulating the supply of socially used drugs. It didn't make any difference at all to the government's agenda. Now, it's my belief that there is nothing that would so sharply reduce crime in Britain as a properly regulated drug market. And Britain has the biggest drug problems in the developed world, proportionate to its population. Now, it's for other people to provide those figures. I've done it in the past, other people may do it this afternoon, but we have that in relation to cannabis, cocaine and heroin, the most popular illegal drugs. And when I say drug problems, I mean not problems for the users, of course those exist, so much as violent crime in the protection of the supply chain, from importers to retail dealers, corruption in places like Mexico and Colombia, which have become criminalized states, or else where civil war has developed around drugs, the waste of resources in enforcement, and the sucking of young people into crime, because in some places in London, they see the drugs business as a sensible career choice. The people with the best cars and girlfriends are the ones in the drugs trade. Okay, so now about policing. And drugs are different. You can't say, oh, we'll just legalise them all as if they're all the same. That would be mad, in my view. Any more than the rules around alcohol and tobacco are the same. They're not, and they wouldn't make any sense if they were. Now, if we take cannabis, we can expect it to be licensed something like tobacco, which is in some respects like tobacco. There will be controls then, if it's like tobacco, over the premises, licensed premises, over the people who sell it, the licensees, the hours of sale, perhaps. There isn't any such control over tobacco, but there is over alcohol. The ages of customers and staff, the fact, obviously, that you have to keep business accounts, and that you pay duty on it, and that the shop owner pays tax. Tax and duty are the Treasury's job. Licensing would fall to local authorities in the way that it does now, with the police having powers to enforce the law, again, just as they do now in relation to pubs and clubs, for example. The effect will be a reduction in violence in the drugs trade, because traders, instead of having to provide their own protection, will do what every law-abiding shop owner does: they call the police if they need protection. So that the necessity to have, somebody comes into your shop and wants some of what you want at the point of a knife, how likely are you not to call the police if you're a trader? Of course, that's what happens. You expect, that's what they're paid for, to come and protect you. If you're selling drugs illegally, of course you don't do that. So that's why the violent protection around drugs is so pernicious. It would just go away. There'd be a reduction in toxicity. It's interesting, this. If you look at the legal drugs, the pressures are all for lower tar, for example. In tobacco, you can't get the drugs, the cigarettes that I was brought up on. You can't get senior service. You certainly can't get Capstan full strength. You can't get the tobacco that you used to be able to produce, because the duty on it is arranged so that it's too expensive. But with alcohol, what's taxed? It's the alcohol that's taxed. Why spirits have a much higher level of tax on a bottle than a beer does. So you would expect that in relation to commercially available cannabis over the counter, that the levels of the what are seen as either the active ingredient or the harmful elements in it would tend to reduce through them being commercially available. Exactly the opposite of what happens when drugs are illegal. They get stronger. The best example is cocaine, which when chewed as coca leaf in the Andes was one level of toxicity, and then it's refined to a further level of toxicity by pure white powder, and then it's found that by mixing it with baking powder you can make something which is even stronger, more powerful, and more socially damaging, namely crack. So why has that happened? Because the stronger amount, the more active ingredient per pound, the better it is for the smuggler. So you refine it, you make it more powerful, and that's the trend that has happened in relation to cocaine, heroin, and of course cannabis. Why are people so keen on making stronger cannabis? Stronger cannabis, which has the effect, higher risk of causing psychosis. So that reduction in toxicity would be a good thing. There would, of course, be the tax and duty revenues. There's a recent paper suggesting it would be about £1 billion a year from cannabis. I have no idea if that's right, but it should please the government. Of course, there'd be savings on law enforcement that would be, in my view, much bigger than that. Not just police, but prisons, there would be many fewer people in prisons, not because they're in there necessarily for drug offences as such, but because they're in there for drug-related offences. That's to say, stealing in order to feed a habit. Or on the fringes of, in the case of violent offences, on the fringes of the supply chain. Communities, as a result, would be liberated from crime and gangs, which focus on and get a substantial portion of their income from drugs. And there would be different role models for young people growing up in those areas. Take heroin. Heroin should be regulated quite differently, and I have yet to hear of or see anything better than the Swiss model. The current position means that many heroin addicts are constantly short of money and steal, not to mention beg and sell themselves in order to get the money for drugs. Heroin addicts arrested for theft have been found to have committed many times larger numbers of property acquisitive crimes than non-addicts arrested for the same offences. Legalisation along the Swiss model will simply make this volume crime disappear. The Swiss model, as you probably know, is to supply addicts through clinics as much heroin as they want, bluntly. The effect has been, over the years, that as this approach has been, in the typical careful Swiss way, rolled out throughout the country, in about 20 years since it started, it's now nationwide. It has substantially reduced the number of people addicted to heroin and substantially increased their average age. In the same period, of course, both those trends have gone in the opposite direction in this country. Once people don't have to focus their lives on where the next fix is coming from, they have the time and the opportunity to get their lives in order and introduce other things into their lives which make it more likely that they will come off heroin, and that is what has been and is happening in Switzerland. Ironically, the Swiss modelled their arrangement on what's known as the old British model, but we've lost that model and it needs to be reinvented and rolled out nationally at much greater speed than the rather feeble attempts to introduce something similar in this country at the moment. The police wouldn't be involved in that sort of regulation at all. It's medical. The effect on policing would be a sharp reduction in the amount of volume crime and a very big reduction in the illegal heroin business and the violence associated with it. If you can get it legally for nothing, nice and clean and pure, why would you want to pay for it and not be sure what you're getting? I believe the illegal market would largely disappear. Just less for the police to do. And that should please George Osborne, as he will be able to reduce police budgets.